Vikings, chapter 5. As we crept inside the house, I could tell that almost everyone was asleep, but only my father was still awake. I could just about make out his shadowy profile as he sat on the ground near the fire, where only the glowing embers remained. "I'll see you in the morning," whispered Tolly as he attempted to creep away into the darkness. "Boys, come here a moment," my father said in a raised whisper. He was not going to let either of us get away quite so easily. "Where have you been?" he asked as we sat down beside him. At first, neither of us responded until finally I muttered, "At the wharf, Father." "What were you doing there?" He continued to interrogate us. "Well, we were looking at the ships," offered Tolly. "One of the ships is being ready for a raid." "Is that so?" he replied. Tolly would like to go with them," I offered. "But not you," he said, if he were stating a fact. I did not reply. A warrior does not always know when it is time to be ready to become a warrior, he said softly. Only Odin and Tyr know that. When the time comes for fighting arrives, you will both be ready. Now, go get some sleep. You have chores to do in the morning. Tolly and I stood up and kissed my father. Then we scuttled off into the darkness of the central hall. "I'll see you bright and early in the morning," I teased Tolly, knowing that he hates to get up before the sun had risen into the sky. I took off my woolen tunic and I lay down. It felt good to rest my head upon my down pillow. I pulled my woolen blanket up around me and closed my eyes. My grandmother is always the first person to get up each morning before sunrise. She made porridge and bread for the entire family. Shortly after she arose, my father and mother would join her in the hearth, by the hearth. Mother would put logs in the embers, and father would disappear into his forge. Minutes later, Uncle Sven, my mother's brother, he would join my father, and the day's work would begin. The sound of the hammer hitting the anvil and the hiss of the hot metal and the fire are never far away. I lay in the darkness, listening to the early morning hustle and bustle. These were the sounds of my childhood. These were the memories I would keep in my heart for the rest of my life. Suddenly, my eyes began to water. I quickly pinched myself to stop the flow of tears. As the porridge simmered and the bread baked, Mother, grandmother, and Aunt Kristen went to work in the small room behind the central hall. This was the room where the sheep's wool was spun and woven on a loom and sewn make warm clothes and blankets. Thread from flax was woven into the linen garments that could be worn during the warmer months. In addition to looking after the chickens, my sister Kitta was being taught how to spin, weave, and sew. In the same way that I was being taught how to be a blacksmith. My Aunt Kristen was perhaps one of the most skillful women in our town at using vegetable dyes from plants to color linen cloth before it was cut and sewn into garments. She explained to me once that the color blue was extracted from the woad plant. And the color red was extracted from the madder plant. And the yellow was extracted from weld. We children were responsible for gathering these plants. Tolly did not work as an apprentice like me. Instead, he worked on his Uncle Eric's farm on the edge of the town. There, he tended the flock of sheep that provided many of the townspeople with wool. And he cared for the herd of cattle that provided additional milk as well as meat. Although there was not a lot of it, the grain and vegetables produced in the fields were needed to feed our growing population. Even the long grass was used on the thatched roofs of our houses. Or to cover the inside dirt floors. Very often, in the late part of autumn, the older cattle were killed and the meat was dried. This provided much needed food during the winter time. Tolly, Bjorn, Kitta, Armstead, and Carl, it's time to get up, said Grandfather Offie as he shuffled toward us in the dim light. Come on, you sleepy heads. We need more wood for the fire, and we need eggs. And get a pitcher of goat's milk too, he ordered. I could just make out the younger children stretching and yawning. And I could see that Tolly was the last one to lift his head from his pillow. I heard him loudly, several times, and then down again. Moments later, Grandfather Affy threw one of his leather shoes and he fell backwards. Come on, Tolly, let's go and chop some wood, I suggested, all the while laughing at him. Tolly grunted at me by way of a reply. Tolly and I worked together at chopping up the larger pieces of wood that were stored in the enclosure at the side of our house. Fortunately, our homeland had many forests that provided us with wood for our ships, our homes, as well as fuel for the fires in our hearths. Wood was one of the few things we had in abundance. And while we chopped wood into logs, Tolly and I we discussed the journey that we would soon be taking across the great ocean to Iceland. Hey, you know, Born, there are enormous sea monsters that can devour a man in one gulp. And they dwell in the watery depths of the great ocean, he said quite seriously. I've heard stories about them, but I've never seen one, I replied calmly. Well, it's true, he continued. It's best to keep a spear by your side at all times, even when you're sleeping, Tolly advised me. You don't want to be caught without it if one rises up out of the waves. I was not sure a spear would be much use against the creature that Tolly had described, but I nodded in agreement. An hour must have passed by when we heard the sound of our grandmother's voice calling us for breakfast. She didn't have to call any of us twice. Tolly sprinted toward the house and I followed close behind him. We quickly washed our hands, washed our faces in a bucket of fresh water that was placed outside the entrance to our home. As we sat together around the hearth, Grandmother ladled porridge into the wooden bowls, which she then handed to us. Mother gave each of us a wooden spoon. In addition to the hot porridge, there was fresh bread, cheese, boiled eggs, and dried herring laid out on a large wooden platter. A pitcher of warm goat's milk was placed beside the platter. Each day, Viking families came together to eat 2 meals: breakfast, dinner. Of the two, breakfast was my favorite. At breakfast time, the older family members were less tired and therefore less grumpy. And the events of the day were still a mystery waiting to happen. I sat on the floor in between Tolly and Kidda, and I devoured the warm porridge When I finished my bowl of porridge, I reached for some bread and cheese and then poured some goat's milk into a wooden cup. "Eat up, Bjorn," said my father, smiling at me. "Today is the day we begin to make your sword."